Welcome back to the program. Now, despite agriculture being the biggest employer in the country, in Kenya specifically, and making up the largest chunk of Kenya's GDP, private sector credit to it is barely over 4%. Now, given that in less than 2 decades, every other person in Africa will be living in a city, providing affordable food to billions across the continent, is both a problem but also a tantalizing business opportunity. The question, though, is why there's so little credit flowing into agriculture, not just in Kenya, but across sub-Saharan Africa. That's a question I explored earlier on with my panel.
I can tell you for a fact, just from a vanilla perspective, that most commercial banks in the Kenyan sense do not have products to be able to service the agriculture industry, simply because we either have the large-scale farmers, the floriculture, horticulture farmers of Kenya, and we have the small-scale farmers, the guys in between who are trying to make it much more commercially viable and scale up. There isn't much support for them from a financial perspective.
Right. So, Grant, same argument, same thing happens for your farmers?
Yeah. So we see a lot of interest from banks now that Twiga is the largest buyer of several basic commodities, and we have the data on where pricing goes for the market, what a farmer's transaction history is selling onto the Twiga platform. It starts to make what was just a half commercial, half subsistence farm into a viable business enterprise, and now that farmer becomes a bankable business. The giant problem for banks in the market has been that 98% of agricultural produce is sold informally. So farmers, if you ask them what their biggest problems are, the price they get for their crop is number 5. Their number 1 largest problem is access to market. It's I'm growing a crop, but I don't know what I'm going to get for it. I don't know if anybody's even going to show up and buy it. That makes it very, very hard to lend into when a farmer can't work off fixed ROIs. So what we need to do is stabilize the market infrastructure first before we can even worry about lending into farmers from the production level side.
We keep talking about climate change and droughts becoming more frequent, more intense, and the gap between them becoming a lot smaller over and over across sub-Saharan Africa. In that sort of scenario, with water becoming an increasingly scarce resource, it does seem, at least at face value, to sort of threaten the hydroponics model, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't, surprisingly. The hydroponic model only uses, first of all, it recycles the water. So you can keep on using the same amount of water, the same ton of water. Again, in addition, you only use 10% of the water that you'd normally use on conventional methods of farming.
Kenya, with all its shenanigans, about what, 25% of it at best is arable. We've got tax issues from here to the North Pole and back. Why set up an agricultural startup here? So
the foundational challenge with Kenya's agriculture sector is market infrastructure. And this is why it's interesting. The Nairobi, for instance, has moved from a population of 700,000, 800,000 people 20 years ago to now 6 million people in the metro area. And we're still feeding that population off of vendors walking to a central market, walking outside, hiring a push carting that back to their shop. That's no way to feed a population. That's why you see rampant food inflation. It hit 17% this year, nearly all inflation in Kenya.
A big chunk of that is usually, food inflation is mostly a poor person's problem.
Yeah, exactly. So now food insecurity, which used to be a rural problem, it used to be about arid lands. Now food insecurity in urban areas is equal to that in rural areas. It's 18%, both places. But with challenges comes opportunity, and what we saw at Twiga was a way to build that market infrastructure in a digital way with logistics of fulfillment in a much cheaper way than having to build physical marketplaces or physical commodities markets to do so. So that's why Kenya Kenya set up a good opportunity, and for us a template that can work across the rest of the continent, because it's just not Nairobi that has this problem in a rapidly urbanizing continent. Now there are 50 cities over 1 million people. In almost every city's market infrastructure is a fraction of where it needs to be. So Kenya's been a great test case for Twiga, but it's just the beginning for us.
So when are you moving into Nigeria?
Nigeria seems like the hardest nut to crack of all the nuts. So we'll give it a couple of years.
My conversation there with Ibada Ahmed and Grant Brooke of Twiga Foods a little earlier.